Hi, dear listeners. This is Kate Riga. I'm here to make a quick pitch that you consider becoming a TPM Prime member. TPM has used the member model for over a decade now, and our loyal members are the only reason we've been able to weather the turbulence of the media landscape and avoid the fate that has befallen so many other independent outlets. For $70, you get no paywall, fewer ads, access to the Hive member forum, a members only newsletter, and more. For $140 a year, you get all of that, plus no ads at all. Without our members, there is no podcast, not to mention that I'm out of a job. Thank you so much for listening and supporting us. We couldn't do it without you.
Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast featuring Kate Riga. It is January 8th, and it's actually, it's 1 week away from the first live edition of the podcast. A bunch of you are going to see us next week down in DC for the first live one. If you're still interested in joining us, we have about 20 tickets left. Probably be gone by the time that the actual event rolls around. If you're hearing this episode of the podcast, the one we're recording right now, on Wednesday, January 8th, there might be a few left. So if you're interested, come see us. Come. It'll be a lot of fun. We're going to do, Kate and I, going to do a live edition of the podcast. You can kind of imagine what that's going to be like. And afterward, there's drinks. Everybody kind of hangs out, talks, and everything. We get to meet you. You get to meet us. All sorts of good stuff. So come meet us. It's if you're a member, it's $50 ticket. If you're not, $75 ticket. A lot of good entertainment, evening of good entertainment, and this will be right before the big switchover, right? January 15th. I guess a little less than a week, 1 day less than a week before the new management comes in for the country and all that good stuff. Before we get to what we're going to talk about this week, I wanted to mention sort of what we shouldn't be talking about. So I'll try to dispense with that quickly. When I was looking at the news this morning, and I was writing some stuff about Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook and all the stuff with the big tech billionaires kind of getting on the Trump train and everything. Everything I saw was whether we're invading Greenland and whether we're going to invade Panama and take back the canal that basically the U.S. built there about a century ago. After I don't know how much everybody knows this history, but we kind of created Panama in the sense that we took advantage of a kind of a sort of a separatist movement in, if I'm remembering this, in Colombia, right? And said, all right, well, we're going to back you guys, and we're going to help you cleave off this little part of another country so we can build a canal there. So there's a whole, I don't know, kind of complicated history. But the thing is, though, we're not going to do any of these things. None of these things aren't going to happen. I can virtually guarantee that we're not going to make Canada into a state. There's a big, we have this big debate about, you should, what is it? That line, when people tell you who you are, you should believe them. There's a lot of misgivings or whatever by dismissing some things Trump says. Some things you shouldn't dismiss, but all of these things about taking over other countries, I certainly don't blame the other countries for being a little mad about it. But I don't want to live inside this guy's nonsense before he actually does anything. And I guarantee you that these things are not going to happen. If I'm wrong, there's no big penalty for my guarantees being wrong. So maybe I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. And this is definitely some muscle memory that we need to get used to using, not to be in this constant outrage cycle about the things that are just, this is like when pro wrestlers do their thing of running around and mocking their enemies and threatening and stuff like that, or when, I don't know, rappers get in their little kind of battles and everything. It's we have to remember how this guy operates, and not get into this constant cycle about the things that are his nonsense and drama. On the immigration front, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but some things are going to happen. Absolutely. That's real, right? Invading Greenland is not real. If he can convince the people who live in Greenland to sort of accede to the United States, so like, okay, whatever. That wouldn't be the end of the world if Greenland became a territory. I don't think they want to do it. Um, we have to be really careful, develop some competence in not living within this guy's drama and see him for what he is, which is an old guy who rants about a lot of stuff that he doesn't do. So that's my little kernel of wisdom for today. So what we're really going to get into is things that are happening, and that is, Trump won the big prize. He won the election, and that meant that in practice, all of the ongoing legal cases against him, he won those too. But he is really focused on not he can't win graciously, right? The judge in New York wants to sentence him. I believe it's Friday, and they've telegraphed pretty clearly. He's not going to say, "Okay, you're sentenced to jail. I don't know how you're going to work out the president thing from jail." He has signaled, and I guess this probably would have been, you don't get a low grade felony. You probably don't get sent to jail on your first offense. So it's not like he's necessarily even giving him a pass, but they're signaling very clear he's going to get some kind of non-custodial sentence, but he doesn't want that. He also doesn't want this report about his federal crimes to come out. So we're in this kind of final drama here about whether he can, cover up the details of these crimes that he's not going to be punished for. So Kate, what set us up on this? What's going on on these two fronts?
So let's start with the sentencing in the hush money case. This is the, Stormy Daniels pay to cover up the alleged affair to try to protect his chances of being reelected. And it was a surprise
Or elected the first time.
Yeah.
Elected, right. Yeah, in 2016.
Did I say
reelection?
Right.
Reelected, but okay. Same difference. He's always got a few pans in the fryer.
Right. So, to protect his interests in getting elected. And so when this order came down, it came down on Friday. I know because I was on the Hill and we had just had a really kind of frantic, busy day covering the speakership election. And then you get this surprise order from Merchan in New York saying, I've got to sentence you before the presidency and time's a ticking. And so we're going to do that real soon. And then he gave a clue, as you alluded to in his little ruling, saying, because he's going to be president, it makes sense to do some kind of, really low stakes thing where basically his conviction is in the record, basically, right? Like he's a felon, but there's not even going to be any kind of low grade, I don't know, fees or community service or whatever. It would just be kind of, confirmation that you did this, it's bad, you go about your life, more or less.
So I didn't realize that I thought he had just kind of said, I'm not going to sentence you to jail, not going to put you on probation. So he's even gone past that and kind of said, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to kind of confirm that this happened.
Right. He said that he wrote a non-conditional release seems the most appropriate in this situation. Of course, as you say, that's not something Trump wants. So he appealed it. The appellate court backed up Merchan, which also I was glad about because my first reaction when I saw this was they're going to kill him. Like Merchan's in trouble, I mean, my my first reaction was, I hope he's got kind of security or the marshals or something, because being the guy who's like, no, I'm going to sentence Trump anyway when no one else is, that's kind of a scary place to be in when all of Trump's like wackadoo followers are, armed to the teeth and everything. But anyway, so the appellate court backed him up. Now Trump has lobbied the Supreme Court to put a stop to the sentencing. And I think the reason why that might actually work for him is just the timeline is so tight that even if they just hand down a stay, I mean, guess what? He becomes president
Yep.
and
Yep.
he's got immunity and it all goes away. And then your like greatest quote unquote hope is kind of that they pick up this thread again after his term when he's 82 and presumably, I mean, who knows, but maybe exiting the world stage at that point. So,
Or the world. Yeah.
or the world, yeah.
Right. Right. Right.
So that's where things are there. The Supreme Court has asked for Alvin Bragg's response by Thursday morning, and the sentencing would happen on Friday. So we're going to probably get a response here in pretty quick succession. And I think also, just to the point of trying to determine what is Supreme Court cronyism and what is a legitimate move here, it's untested water stuff, kind of, but also a little silly. Like, he's doing the whole "this will hurt my reputation" thing, which, yeah, shut up. That's why people don't do crimes. And then the other piece is they're trying to say presidential immunity attaches now in the transition time. And it's like, okay, so to buy that argument, you have to say there are two presidents at the same time, right? Which seems to kind of run afoul of a whole lot of norms. So,
Well, by immunity in this case, I don't think we're talking about the immunity that was at the center of the case that sort of that you know deep sixed the January 6th prosecution. We're talking about the immunity from entanglements of just lawsuits or criminal prosecutions during a presidency, right? That
mhm,
kind of, so it's not immunity exactly. It's like the timeout you get that you can't be process. I mean, that seems like a bit of a stretch.
right.
Um, yeah, but the two presidents thing, I didn't even occur. I mean, we're so deep in this point to we're so deep at this point into the Supreme Court just kind of making arguments that amount to, this is just so messy. We can't be bothered with this, as opposed to things. I know it's controversial, but the idea that a president can't be indicted even at the state level is, that's a real thing. You can't really be president when you're I don't know, in you know getting remanded to jail without bail. I mean, those are real things, whereas opposed to this is not a real thing. But I guess we'll see.
Right. And as I say, you have the almost procedural out, right? Like, if the Supreme Court delays this even by half a day, I mean, it's ball game essentially. So I still think the odds there are a little more favorable to Trump than in this kind of parallel effort to quash the Jack Smith reports, which are, we're calling it report singular, but it's two volumes. One of them is on
Oh,
the
interesting. I
class.
didn't real Okay.
Yeah, one is the classified documents Mar-a-Lago thing. One is Trump's role in January 6th. And this came out of an effort from two of the Trump aides who were co-defendants, are now, singular defendants in the Mar-a-Lago docs case, trying to block the release of the report because their case is ongoing, right? Like, Trump is basically kind of done with all the legal stuff, but these peons don't get the same, warm embrace of the Supreme Court. So they're still on the hook. And they were like, you got to block this. That's prejudicial. Our case is ongoing. And I think that's the only kind of gasp of legitimacy in this whole situation.
Yeah, there's some
And
logic to that.
right. But That's just the Mar-a-Lago docs case, right? Which is currently before the 11th Circuit. However, these guys went to Eileen Cannon, who had the case at the district level, knowing that she's a pal, she's a friend, she's there through thick and thin. And they asked her to kind of shut it down. She was like, yep, will do. Check, blocked. And in her order, she doesn't really specify the volume of the report that's about the document. So she is just kind of purporting to shut down the whole investigation, which not even clear she has any authority over the documents thing. It's before the appellate court at this point. She's kind of done with her part to play unless they send it back down to her. B, she never had any authority over the January 6th case. Like that started with Chutkin. So, she just is doing a Supreme Court justice audition. That's really all this is. And now we're waiting for a word from the 11th Circuit about what they're going to do kind of with her order, with these requests. Now, Trump is jumping on the bandwagon too, being like, pretending like he cares about his aides, and then, also making pretty obvious he just doesn't want the headlines. And we found out through the filings that his lawyers have been lobbying Garland for a while not to release these reports kind of on the side. And it's just, it's legally really, really silly. Like, sure, these defendants have some interest in not being like preemptively smeared before their cases are finished, but the attorney general can release whatever reports he wants. It's like it's pretty explicitly in his mandate. It's pretty common with the hiring of special prosecutors. We've seen this throughout Biden's term. We saw it in Trump's. Like, Garland can release whatever he wants. I mean, what legal argument is there that he can't? I mean, and for Trump, it kind of boils down to, they're trying everything, right? They're trying this is a disruption of the transition. This is an infringement of my immunity. I don't like it, whatever. But it really boils down to, just like he doesn't want to be a felon in the other case, it's like here he just doesn't want the bad headlines. Like, his lawyers have already read the report. They know that it makes him look really bad, and he doesn't want people to know about that. So the
Right.
kind of latest in this back and forth, just before we started recording, is Jack Smith's team responds and was like, well, we already gave the report to Garland. He has the whole thing. And his plan is to release the January 6th one, and to, for now, while the case is unfolding against these other two guys, keep the Mar-a-Lago documents case kind of under wraps. Just let the judiciary committee heads look at it in Congress, in like a kind of a secure location type thing. And then implied with the intention to release it after the trial is done for these other two guys.
It's okay. So just so we understand all the different moving parts here, and so I'm keeping up. I guess what hangs over this is the almost certain assumption that those trials will never happen because Trump will become president in a couple weeks, and those cases against his Confederates will disappear. So the whole I guess let's it's worth thinking through the ins and outs of this as though that weren't going to happen. It does seem like those defendants actually have some argument here.
Yep.
But I think how that would be played out is that okay, the attorney general can still release whatever report he wants to release, and then those defendants have a decent argument to go into court and say, we want these charges dismissed with prejudice because I can't get a fair trial now because they have released publicly all the evidence or all the evidence they wanted to release without it going before a judge, blah, 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 and jury tainted, and they would have at least a decent argument there. I think that is actually how this would kind of logically play out. The idea that I didn't what I didn't realize until you just kind of walked me through it is that I didn't know they had so neatly separated these two reports, that even though it's nominally a report, there's like part one and part two. So you release part one and don't release part two. And the good part of that is that we know what happened in the documents case. He stole a lot of documents, and um, that has always been fairly run of the mill criminality. It's a big deal that an ex-president did it. And there are, various unique dimensions of it because he's an ex-president. But at a certain level, it's an ordinary crime. And because of the consequences of the election, he'll get away with it. We know that. But it's nothing like January 6th. That is something that has great historical consequences, and we should know all of the evidence that was brought to bear. We should see I take the report, as I understand it, has all the interviews, or all the interviews that were done with various witnesses and blah 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 blah. So it's actually kind of fine if we don't see the Florida documents case. Is not great, but I'm not sure it's not like the historical record is incomplete. And there's actually, as you said, um, there is a real issue at stake if we set aside the fact that we know that those cases against those two underlings are going to disappear in a few weeks, that they would actually, they actually have a case on their rights.
Right. I mean, that's kind of why I think what I would do is probably just drop the charges against the underlings too and do the 2
Yeah,
reports. I mean, we
and drop
know.
have them dismissed with prejudice,
Right.
so they actually can't be brought back. Yeah,
We know
yeah,
that, as you say, Trump's people are days away from taking over the DOJ. I mean, there's just no way that they're gonna wanna go after anyone in his orbit, no matter if they care about these particular underlings or not. So,
right.
I mean, from that lens, do that, release the reports. It's not beyond the pale to imagine that there's some details in the documents case that we don't know about that are kind of uniquely concerning. Like, you can imagine a situation where they found out that he showed foreign envoys stuff, or, other
Yep.
kind of scary stuff in that vein that's a little bit more than just kind of like, no, fuck you, National Archives, I'm keeping these in my bathroom because I want to type thing.
Right, right.
But I totally agree. The January 6th one has always been, it's loomed the largest, right? It's the coup. It's the big one. It's important. And I'm glad that at least thus far the DOJ posture has been like, no, we're releasing this. Like, kind of get over yourself. Because I mean, we've talked about this in the recent pods, but God, like the whole kind of Biden administration's like willingness to just go out with a whimper and like leave liberal democracy in this super perilous state without much less, I mean, without saying much about it, much less kind of taking any actions to put in reinforcements, has been, I think, a really driving part of the enormous demoralization everyone feels. Like, we keep talking about this sense of like, oh, everyone's given up. It's like, yeah, so has Biden, far as I can tell. So I'm glad that at least right now the posture is the attorney general has the power to do this. Eileen Cannon is like smoking drugs. We don't have to listen to her. 11th Circuit, please kind of like affirm this immediately, and we'll kind of get on with ourselves while being very responsible about the case against these two aides, And you can see a world where in a Trump DOJ, knowing that these prosecutions aren't going to go anywhere, that they would just kind of be like, fuck them, Like, I'm not that worried about tainting the jury pool or whatnot. Like, this whole thing makes, in this situation, Biden look terrible. So let's just, and if it takes some underlings with it, be that as it may.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think I I think about Biden's behavior post election a little differently, not a lot differently, a little differently. I saw something, I don't know, in one of the sort of Politico or Axios kind of newsletters. They had a piece, I don't know, in the last 24 or 36 hours, basically how, Biden is kind of trolling Trump now. And they talked about, he gave, what is it, some presidential award to Liz Cheney, and he pardoned people. But to your point, that's like, that's pretty thin gruel, right? For the kind of stuff that you're talking about. In my mind, look, the big thing is that Trump won the election, and so he gets away with everything. That's the reality, and the number of things that I think Biden can actually do are limited. Having said all that, I got an email from a longtime reader this morning, and he said basically like, is there any reason that Garland can't literally just send email the PDF to Biden this morning? And the answer to that is crystal clear. No, there's no reason that he can't do that.
Official
Um,
acts, baby.
well, and not even just official acts. That the the great danger in our system, or one of the very real and present dangers about Donald Trump in our system, is that the only thing that prevents the president from using the Department of Justice as his own personal attack law firm is a series of norms and discretion. Because the reality is, and that is what all these decisions are based on, and the reason that many of these decisions couldn't actually be otherwise is that the president is given the power under the Constitution to enforce the law. And so really, Merrick Garland and Jack Smith and all these people are just staffers for Joe Biden. That is the reality, and that is what makes electing someone like Donald Trump so dangerous. That they're also that Pam Bondi woman and probably Kash Patel are also just staffers. So they can resign, they can do all sorts of stuff, but they work for him. So yeah, absolutely. Now there's it maybe gets a little more complicated when you say, can Biden just post it to the White House website? But there too, yeah. I mean, and that's why, honestly, I mean, they should certainly go through the motions until January 20th. But I don't think the courts have any. I don't even recognize the court's actual say over this. There is, as we've discussed, there's some legitimate issues with those two, like, notional defendants down in Florida who are not actually going to be defendants. But the January 6th stuff, you just post it, and then the courts can absolutely say. They could even say maybe that they're going to dismiss, because as I understand it now, um, the January 6th case against Donald Trump was dismissed without prejudice. So in theory, he can bring that back in 4 years. Maybe a judge would say, like, actually, now we're going to dismiss it with prejudice because you've tainted it now. Whatever, that is something that judges can do. But this is just something that someone who works for Joe Biden did a bunch of investigating, and he can publicize it if he wants to. I just, don't even recognize the court's authority in this.
Yeah, I totally agree. And my criticism of Biden also encompasses my criticism of congressional Democrats in terms of like, I just think I agree with you. Trump won the election. There's nothing you can do about that. But kind of the drum I've been beating is like, you have to hit the ground running in terms of figuring out how you are going to win in 2026. And like,
Mhm.
the benefit of having a year before you really have to like gear up the campaigns there is like, you have time to do trial and error, like go hard at pitches and see what resonates and what doesn't. And like, I hope that there'll be a parallel effort to kind of figure out ways to permeate the non-traditional media spaces. And that goes hand in hand with this. But I thought an obvious place to start is have the committees that you still have chairmanship over in the Senate go balls to the wall. Like, take everything that you think might be a vulnerability for Trump and hold hearings on them, and to the extent that you have any like investigative string that didn't make its way into the public, do it now, big fanfare, splashy. Like, we saw the January 6th committee, right? Like, they can figure out how to make this stuff telegenic and exciting in a way that reporters will want to cover it, and that is kind of made for clips on social media. And I think it would have been good practice, if nothing else, to start getting a little more comfortable, especially for senators who are so, kind of conditionally, who are so like characterologically opposed to the bombastic theatrical stuff. Um, but yeah, I mean, that's just an addendum to this. Like there's no reason why these reports shouldn't come out. And to some degree, if the courts are being ridiculous, then Biden should say, yeah, fuck it, I'm gonna do it myself. Like, if there's one thing we've learned, it's that presidents are all powerful, right? So I mean, put it to the test.
Yeah, and this is a case in which it's not you don't even have to make use of that, because that is a kind of a technical matter about criminal immunity from official acts after the fact. Um, but again, Merrick Garland can send that over to Joe Biden today, and Joe Biden's just a guy, right? Just president. He's not part of some like judicial process. So yeah, and hopefully it won't come to that. But that is kind of, again, I think that one of the things that we've seen a lot about, and I think is people having a hard time processing their very real sense of loss is, oh, you were saying, you told us for months that democracy was on the line, blah 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 blah, and now you're just gonna hand it over to Donald Trump, and so I guess none of that stuff you said was true. Well, we said democracy was on the line, so we're going to do a coup now. I mean, what? Like, yeah, that kind of sounds good, but it actually doesn't make any sense. Like, yeah, you could keep saying that. I don't know what that would accomplish. It's everybody. There's that kind of classic thing where the someone can't attack who they're mad at, so they kick the dog, right? Or in a sort of an uglier example, kind of uh, traditional 1950s male figure, is upset at work, so he beats his wife, or he beats his kids, or I don't know. There's always this issue of displacing what you're mad at, right, onto more vulnerable people, and I kind of feel like that's what some people are doing about this interregnum period.
To me, it's just though that there hasn't even been like messaging. Like, I hear you that there's limited stuff you can do, but the
Hmm.
January 6th op-ed that Biden wrote was like mealy mouthed. It didn't even name Trump in particular. I mean, to me, like, what I want from them here is not for Biden to be like, well, I did X, Y, and Z and now everything's fine. Like, we're not naive, right? He has to hand over the keys. But I think he truly believes that Trump is a threat to democracy, right? That was a
Hmm.
big part of his
Hmm.
campaign, a big part of
Hmm.
his vice president's campaign. It's like, okay, so what now? Like, now we're just being left with a message of like, remember January 6th, and democracy is important, and we're going to force Kamala Harris to preside over certifying an election she lost, and we're going to have a stiff upper lip and be the big guys. And it's kind of like, okay, fine, and then what? Like, I'm just waiting for something that's like has any kind of forward propulsion, or is it gives people any sense that like things are dark right now, but we're gearing up. We're, kind of gathering the forces. We're strategizing. We're here. We're live. Like, we're gonna take back over in 2 years. There's just
Hmm.
none of that. It's just
No, I
totally
I
flaccid.
I totally agree with you on that. I totally agree with you on that. What I didn't have a lot of patience for. One thing people got very upset about was Biden had Trump over and they took pictures together. And that's just kind of a Biden thing. He's a process kind of guy. This is what you do, right? He won, and so you have that meeting. It's something Trump was too much of a loser and a baby to do. I mean, remember, he didn't show up for the inauguration because he's something that I'm not even going to say on this show. But I agree with you that the idea that, oh, kind of, let's not forget uh, January 6th, a kind of a dark day in our history that we're trying to close the page on, because we haven't closed the page on it, because it's actually still going on. We are still in a uh, we are still in a larger drama that January 6th is about, because the guy who did January 6th, under our rules, managed to win a presidential election. He's going to become president again.
Yeah.
So I agree with you on that. I'm not saying that they have handled it in the way that I would have wanted them to handle. I completely agree with you on that. I think that um, there is there is some element of this that is, I can't actually do anything about the real bad actor here, Donald Trump. So I'm gonna just kind of get really mad at Joe Biden. And the reality is, Joe Biden's presidency is over. His role in public life is over. And we'll have to leave to future generations to kind of make their decision about what they think of his presidency. But he's done. And we all here have to, along with the Democratic minorities in the House and the Senate, need to kind of figure out how we're going to pick up the pieces, and that's tough. And I agree that uh, they haven't handled it the way that I would have handled it. I also think that the other ways they could have handled it have limited impact. I mean, we're really going to see what we're dealing with, starting on January 20th. And that's just the reality.
So let's dip into Congress for a bit. As I mentioned at the top, on Friday were the speakership elections. And despite the fact that Trump had kind of thrown his clout behind Mike Johnson, there was still some drama, which I think in and of itself is something we should remember, especially at a time like right now where there's this overwhelming sense that Trump is all powerful, Trump is infallible, Trump did a coup and he got more votes the next time he ran. And that stuff is all real and troubling, and we will be detangling it for years to come. But Trump said, I want this guy to keep being speaker. And it was an open question about if his party was going to respond to that or not.
Mm-hmm.
And we
Mm-hmm.
saw that play out on Friday, even though Mike Johnson did ultimately win on the first ballot, which he did, by the way, with some like procedural chicanery that hasn't gotten a ton of attention outside the like super process nerds in Congress. But they kind of like hid the Republican vote counters to keep the vote open improperly. Like they're not supposed to just keep a vote open forever on the floor.
Oh,
Um,
I thought they had some ability just to kind of keep it open. Like, what? Walk us through that. What was that? I thought that was kind of their call. Like, oh, we're just gonna have this be a never-ending vote to give Mike and Trump a chance to kind of bring these guys around.
Yeah, no, I mean, after everyone has voted, you can't just keep a vote open, but I'm not at all an expert on this, but basically there's like they're called tellers who do the vote counts for either party, and they like report the counts to the clerk kind of thing. But the Republicans kept their tellers off the floor, basically like hidden away from the clerk, so they couldn't like finalize the count. And that's how they held it open long enough for Johnson to cajole the holdouts to switch their votes to him so he could do it and won and have that distinction.
Oh, okay. I didn't. I did. How is this is and maybe you won't know these details, but these tellers, are they also staffers of the House in the way that the clerk is, or are they kind of like little butlers for the party? So they'll do what Mike Johnson. Walk us.
Right.
How's
My
that work?
impression is more the latter. They are like openly kind of partisan figures, not just Capitol staff.
So they can. So someone from the whip's office just said, like, "Hey,
Right.
Fred, let's go down to the
Right.
delicatessen and hang out there."
Which,
Right.
in a grander scheme, I mean, who cares, right? Like, if he
Yeah,
had done it
yeah,
on the
yeah.
second ballot, I don't think it would have. McCarthy taking 15 is just that's going to be the number from here on out.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, it was like kind of exciting. Honestly, I was in the gallery when it was happening, and every time they got to one of the known holdouts, everyone leans forward, and the House Freedom dudes were kind of doing a thing where they were sitting in the chamber, but they just didn't respond when their names were called, which added drama. We got enough people voting for other people that was like, okay, he's gonna fail. And then
And so the non-voting pulled down the level. Walk us through what the non-voting did
well,
in
they
practice.
ultimately they voted at the end. So they come back to
Right.
them and ask for their vote, and enough of them put in a vote, which they had to do because, as you say, the way the speaker is elected is of present members who are voting for a candidate. So if you just vote present, it just kind of lowers the threshold of what he needs to get that majority. But the problem is, if you have enough Republicans not voting, all of a sudden
Hakeem
Democrats have the
Jeffries. Right,
numbers
right.
to get Jeffries in. So I think people were kind of depicting this as like a really cool move that Chip Roy just like sat and stonily, stared ahead as his name was called. But it felt a lot more to me like they don't fully have their game plan together. So they're going to sit and wait and see if they have the ability to like lodge any kind of protest without necessarily sinking him. That was definitely more like they wanted their main character status intact. They wanted to do what the hard right always does, which is just like register disapproval. But there wasn't the same sense during McCarthy of like, we're really going to fuck him over here.
Well, wasn't that I guess that that seems to me, I mean, with McCarthy, I think as we ultimately found out, there was no real issue of principle. There were enough people who really didn't like Kevin
Exactly.
McCarthy.
Yeah.
And in this case, it seemed that they they wanted to be the Freedom Caucus, and it would almost, in the way that, in the perverse way that things have evolved, it would almost seem weird if they actually just did what a party caucus is supposed to do, like we voted on who our leader is, so now we all go and vote. That's just how it works. But like, you don't get, it's sort of like, hey, parents, we had Christmas, but I didn't get any presents. What? Right? We had a nominal election for speaker, and we didn't have our little fun. But they had a hard time even coming up with a notional explanation of what they were doing it for.
Right.
And
Yeah. I mean, you had Thomas Massey. He came out ahead of the crowd being like, I'm not going to vote for him no matter what. You're not going to change my mind. And because the way the numbers go, Johnson could not have one more Republican vote for anyone else and win. So Massey kind of was quick to like take the spot of I can say no
I get the
without
shit,
ruining
yeah,
everything.
and no one
But
else can.
right. But his quote unquote reasoning was like, something government spending, Ukraine, just like a hodgepodge of like stuff that he doesn't like on some level. But there was a really interesting profile of him, I think, in the Wall Street Journal, where he basically says, my wife just died and like I don't have a lot going on at the moment, and so I'm going to kind of make this my thing, which is on the one hand sad, on the other, god, can we get people with like any amount of emotional maturity in these jobs? Like,
Yeah,
I
I mean,
mean,
it is.
sinking a speakership election shouldn't take precedence in your life because you're like going through you're grieving and you're looking for kind of something to divert your attention to.
Yeah, I mean, it makes it a little harder to like razz him because I think he's a relatively young man, so that's terrible that his wife passed away. But that has nothing to do with anything,
Right.
about this, and that is also important to keep in mind. I mean, my understanding is, and tell me if I'm wrong, that what came out, I guess, that in that period when they had the teller guys, down at the gift shop or whatever, that Trump called Chip Roy and said, "Hey, you got to do this." And Chip Roy's ask was, "Then you stop crapping on me on Truth Social or threatening to primary me. And Trump said, okay, you got a deal. And that was the deal. So basically it was just, and I don't want to, it's not a matter of defending Trump on this, but my understanding is that even at one level, I understand anybody's desire not to deal with Trump's bullshit. But I think the only reason Trump was giving him a hard time was because they weren't agreeing to vote for Mike Johnson.
Yeah.
Right. Or that earlier thing when they scuttled, when they didn't vote for the deal that Elon got it, all that kind of stuff. So it wasn't even like it was all within the nonsense of their drama. It wasn't even kind of like that I don't know, that, Trump for a long time, gave Mitt Romney a hard time because he was never really kind of on the Trump team. But the whole thing is, just, it's all part of the same nonsense. And as Roy sort of conceded in that exchange, that none of it was about anything on principle. It was just, you better be nice to me. And Trump said, fine, I'll be nice to you. And that's how they allowed whatever is going to happen.
Exactly. And I mean, it is foreshadowing to some degree, right? Because electing the speaker is supposed to be the easy part, especially when you have no actual beef with the speaker beyond the
I mean,
Freedom
he's their
Caucus.
guy.
Yeah.
He's a Freedom
Like, I
Caucus
mean,
guy.
their
Yeah.
biggest complaint across the board is they don't like that he passes must pass spending legislation with Democratic help because they will never vote for a reasonable spending bill. So the only way to pass it is with Democrats, which moves the bills left because there has to be enough stuff in it for Democrats to vote for. I mean, it's like they're I'm sorry, they're children. I mean, there's no strategy. It's like, I want to be on TV. I want to be one of the guys saying no. And then the concessions they demand are things like more input. Okay. Yeah. I'm sure it cost Mike Johnson absolutely nothing to be like, yeah, okay, I'll more input. You got it. I'm going to be calling you when it's time to put together legislation, knowing that you will only vote for some kind of like far right wet dream of a bill that has no chance of making it through Congress. Like, for sure, you'll be right up there on my kind of legislative team. So I mean, but the thing is, like, the big question that I had for this trifecta is we knew that there were some of this dysfunction that was going to be present regardless. And that is just part and parcel with what the Republican Party has become, what that wing of it became during the Tea Party movement. Just like, you have this whole generation of Republican legislators who came up in that time, or who came up in the Trump era, who have no practice with legislating, no interest in doing it. I mean, it's always encapsulated by that thing of Madison Cawthorn only having the comms office and not the legislative one. Like, there is just a lot of people, especially in the House, who are crafted in that mold. And all of that was going to carry over, right? That dynamic with needing Democrats to pass stuff, that's going to carry over. But then the interesting point was, does the carrot of helping the Trump presidency smooth some of that over, or at least kind of cool down some of the exciting inflammation of like, oh, there's a friction point here, like, I'm going to exacerbate it to be Fox News's bestest boy for a few days, and what we saw from that, like, spending kerfuffle right before Christmas, and then what we're seeing here, and what we're even seeing at the beginnings of reconciliation, is just there will be some incentive for them to work more with Trump, right? I mean, that's encapsulated by the fact that Johnson did get it in one ballot. It didn't take 15 rounds. And part of that is because, as you say, Trump can call people on the floor and be like, will you go and goddamn vote? And they will, at least some of the time. But also, you're seeing that, like, the Chip Roys, they don't want to lose main character status. Like, they're not just going to go along to get along just because it's kind of King Trump. Like, Chip Roy thinks he's King Chip, like, the people who like him are really into him, and he wants to keep up this kind of like right wing obstructionist, burn it all down kind of hero status. And you simply can't have both those things at the same time. You can't be a burn it all down guy and then be kind of like the administration's best bud who is a dependable kind of rank and file voter. And that's just a way that it was always going to be easier for Democrats to kind of legislate in unity, even with really slim margins, because there simply is not that incentive structure on the left to kind of be the dick. And there are exceptions, Manchin and Sinema and what have you, but like, I mean, it's astounding how much Pelosi kind of kept the House in lockstep. And part of that is that you don't have a Fox News to go on to be like,
Right.
I blew up everything today because I don't like government spending. Like, that just doesn't exist. So I don't know. I think dysfunction to come, and we're going to get into the reconciliation stuff here in a minute, but it was a good amuse-bouche in terms of like how unified will this trifecta really be.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I also think that, just before we get into the reconciliation stuff, as much as, and back to what we were saying before, Democrats absolutely need to be ramping up. I don't want to give anybody the contrary, the contrary sense from what I'm saying. But as powerful as Trump seems right now, we have seen many times that this is as good as it gets. Starting January 20th, he is a lame duck, who has a lot of people in his own party gunning for him, and who faces having to pass a lot of stuff with like a 1 or 2 vote margin in the House and not a terribly big margin in the Senate. So, you know, uh, it's going to be difficult. They're not, it's going to be rocky, and not just because of the Chip Roys.
And as you say, this beginning, what used to be a honeymoon, which is, I mean, not anymore, at least not for Trump. His approval is still under 50%. But this is when they did the tax cuts, right? In 2017, they did those right off the bat. They kind of used the momentum, they passed those, and then they didn't do much of anything else for the rest of the trifecta. The attempt to
Yeah,
repeal Obamacare was kind of it.
the huge failure. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And so now you do get a sense that party leadership knows that, right? Like, and if they have these kind of highfalutin plans for reconciliation, they got to get going, especially because in 2017, what they call the budget vehicle, the kind of shell that the bill goes in, that was already passed when Trump got into office. Not the case here. So now they're caught up in this internecine drama about, are we going to do, they want to do immigration and tax cuts. And the question is, are we going to do those in the same budget vehicle or in two separate ones? And they cannot move forward until they decide that, because they have to pass the shell for these bills. And Trump is saying something different every day. He's given interviews about it. One day he's saying, I prefer the big bill. The next he's like, oh, well, maybe we do it in two. I mean, a
No.
legislative brilliant mind. He is not.
Right. Let me ask you this. So when are we, what's the time frame on when the next debt ceiling vote has to happen? When does that need to happen?
Yeah, I mean, technically, Treasury is already doing extraordinary measures there. As you said, it's a moving target, right? We don't like hit a really exact
It's always
cliff.
soft, but I think
Yeah.
it's a spring kind of thing. And I think the significance of that is that, no one wants, Democrats don't want to help now. Republicans, it's obviously like kryptonite for Republicans. So the only way they can get it done now is to pack it in with a bill that says, oh, we're going to cut tons of taxes and we're going to throw a bunch of immigrants off a cliff, and that's so good, you're also going to raise the debt ceiling. But that's a kind of a spring kind of thing. So this is what, just for our listeners, this is what makes all of this pretty complicated, that you got to pass something relatively soon, because at some point you need to get that debt ceiling thing done.
You
So you
also
can't just
have,
drag this out forever.
and the spending agreement that Johnson reach
Yep.
before Christmas. That expires in March. And this is why you've got Johnson talking about the debt ceiling and saying, Republicans are going to deal with it once and for all. Well, guess what? They're going to run into the same roadblock that Democrats always run into when talk of real reform is on the table, which is you can't just hike it to infinity. You have to hike it to a number. And so then you're asking the Chip Roys to vote for raising the debt ceiling to a gajillion trillion dollars.
Yeah. Now, isn't what remind me of this? I mean, what they should do is get rid of the entire thing. But remind me, I think you can't do that. Is it in the Senate that it's a fit? Like, what is the? It's not that easy. I don't think you can do that on a strict majority vote. And
Right.
and obviously Republicans aren't going to want to do that anyway.
So, yeah, filibusterable in the Senate, which
Right.
leaves the most attractive option just to raise it really high. So you don't run into
Right.
it. And so you don't run into it. But then again, you have to say a number. And even though it's like not real, there are enough Democrats who don't want to say, Senator Josh voted for a gajillion trillion debt ceiling. So,
Right.
it's not going to work, right? It's going to come down to what it always is, like suspending the debt ceiling, kicking that can down the road. But some of the reconciliation drama is also because the incentives in the Senate and the House are so different right now. Like Thune
Yeah.
wants to do them separately because the tax cuts are hard. Like you have to at least nominally find a way to pay for them. Tax policy is always just, it's hard to get done because like people have different kind of niche interests in it. It just tends to be more fraught. Whereas on the immigration front, I think Republicans are probably right in thinking it's the
Let's do
time to
it.
strike. Democrats are
Yep.
absolutely cowed on this issue right now. Like, you're going to get significant buy-in. I don't think it would even be that hard for them to pass a pretty punitive immigration measure through the Senate with significant help.
Well, wasn't there, I think that they have, I forget what it's called, but there's a kind of a, you know, kick immigrant butt bill that they passed last year in the House, which is sort of their maximal bill or whatever. And I believe that the new Democratic senators from Michigan and Arizona voted for it in the House. So it's not like they're going to not vote for it now. So
Right.
I think that's that. It is not only could you pass it um, uh, in the House and the Senate, as you said, you'll probably get a significant amount, quite possibly enough Democratic buy-in to not even have to worry about a filibuster. So that's why it's so attractive to the people in this, to the leadership in the Senate.
But the problem is Mike Johnson knows that he has got a much more difficult needle to thread. So he wants to keep everything together. So the
Yep.
immigration stuff is, it's Build Back Better all over again, right? He wants
Yeah,
the
it's complicated.
immigration
Yeah.
stuff to be the carrot so that when people have issues with the ins and outs of the tax stuff, they'll kind of come along. And also you've got cost of the tax cuts is going to be absolutely enormous. The only way to do, the quote unquote pay fors for that is going to be, as we've talked about, it's going to be Medicaid, it's going to be veteran benefits, it's going to be super
Obamacare.
unpopular stuff.
Yep.
So, all the more reason why you want something like immigration, which Republicans really want, and which Democrats, I think, misguidedly think they need to look really tough on right now. So that's part of it too. Like the two chambers are just, it's different. The margins in the Senate are not huge, but they're significantly larger than in the House. And when you have Trump flip flopping around, everyone's kind of looking around, waiting to take direction and to form a plan, knowing that each chamber favors a different tactic. So it's tricky.
Well, the point, and it's a good point, making the analogy to Build Back Better, because certainly House, conservatives in the House say we saw what happened to the Democrats. you split it up, and man, like, good luck getting part two,
Right.
right? Which is absolutely what they're talking about, and in a non-value laden sense, they're absolutely right. And you make the point. I mean, that is really the story of the first Trump administration. They passed those tax cuts right through, no problem. And you know, you, you make the point right. Tax cuts are easy. Everybody loves tax cuts, and they're frankly always hard to even mobilize opposition to, because at the end of the day, no one cares that much about tax cuts that someone else is getting. They care about how it affects them. And if you don't have to pay for it, it doesn't affect anybody in a direct enough way for anybody to care. And in the House, you can just pass the tax cuts. Just pass them. It's only in the Senate where you've got these rules where at least nominally you have to pay for them. And that is really where and so again, for our listeners, this is where one or two bills, you've got the fact that to get these bills, either, to get the fiscal stuff through the Senate, you've got to cut people's Obamacare, you got to take away their health insurance, you got to take away their Medicaid, you got to cut veterans benefits, you got to do all of this kind of stuff that gets opposition to it. You have the debt ceiling thing out there that's going to hit maybe in March or April or maybe February or something like that. And all of these things are happening, and it's a lot of drama, and not totally sure they're going to be able to do it. And obviously if they are not able to do it in a satisfying way, that will be a big, big, big problem for Donald Trump, because it'll show that notwithstanding being the dictator and the king, he can't even get like a big piece of legislation through the Congress that he runs.
Right.
So there's a lot of stakes there.
So we're just going to wrap up with a little remembrance of Jimmy Carter, who died while we were on holiday break, and now um, his body is kind of taking the trip from Georgia to DC to lie in state. And it's weird because the timing of it, I think, made it a less significant event than it would have been otherwise, because it's kind of right during Christmas. But I don't know, to me, I mean, I really love Jimmy Carter, and I knew I was going to be really sad when he died, even though part of me is like, I don't know, just on the human level, like his quality of life seemed really low there at the end, and Rosalind had already died and all of that, but I can't help but feel a little bit like, we're embarking on like a pretty dark 4 years, and it feels almost like symbolism in a novel or something, that this former president, known for being kind of humble and good in these like small old fashioned ways, died right as it's about to begin.
Yeah. No, it is one of these things that seems a little too, uh, on plot, as it were, or on symbolism or something like that. I think, as you said, that it's always very sad when someone dies. He was obviously lived a very, very, very long life. And as you said, I mean, one of the just kind of wild and wild things about this man's life is that, generally speaking, you enter hospice and you die fairly soon after that. That's kind of how it works, for reasons that I think we all understand. I think he was in hospice for a year, in hospice care. He was at home, but in hospice care, where you're only trying to, reduce suffering and so forth, for a year and a half. That his wife went into hospice care and died in relatively short order over that period of time. But yeah, it is some, I don't know. It beyond symbolism. It's just a kind of it it also, I don't know, combines these two moods and mental states for at least a lot of the country in a sort of uncanny and surreal way. You have sort of Waiting for Trump, which is this very dark, ominous thing. You have Mourning Jimmy Carter, which is mourning and, sort of mourning someone who, for I think most Americans at this point, embodies a lot of very positive things about the country. So it's just weird at various levels. Now, am I right that the flags will still be at half staff when Trump is inaugurated?
Yeah, he's
That's sort of
pissed
one of
about
the
that.
appropriate. Yes, well, I love that. That's great. That is sort of, one of Jimmy Carter's parting gifts for us.
It's kind of funny too because so I wrote our obituary for Jimmy Carter, but I wrote it in 2021 because we got a tip that he was nearing the end of his life, which LOL, I mean, not every tip is turns out to be right, but so I wrote it then, and I kind of it was an interesting assignment because basically, one of our editors, David, said, "I want you to write what you read after you read the kind of like official obituaries, right? Like the one from the New York Times and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Those are going to be the big, comprehensive, like here's his whole life kind of thing." So he's like, "I want you to write something that you would want to read after it." So I kind of wrote it about the meta narrative of like the rediscovery of Jimmy Carter and how for a long time he was just a Republican punchline for liberals being
Absolutely.
weak, effeminate, ineffective, nerdy, like all
Hmm.
that was kind of encapsulated. And then we moved into a phase where people said, well, he was a bad president, but a great post president, right? That
Yep.
he kind of, with his Habitat for Humanity and Carter Center, kind of dedicated himself to bettering the world in a way that presidents just hadn't habitually done before that point. And then I think, especially in the Trump era, he moved into kind of a rediscovery of his presidency as well, and a re-excavation of some issues where he was really prescient and ignored at the time. I think environmentally in particular, you know, there's kind of a lot of evidence that he was the most like progressive environmentalist we have ever had in office, and that was
Yeah. Yeah.
it puts you down the road of like, imagine if we had taken climate change seriously starting in the 70s, what a different position we'd be in now. I mean, but that's a lot of it, right? It feels like a lot of kind of road not taken,
Hmm. Hmm.
little,
Hmm.
green shoots in Jimmy Carter's presidency. And then Reagan took over and just, I mean, put our country on like, I think a much darker and like more unequal and, you know, dangerous path that has really kind of led us to where we are now. But it was just so interesting because I talked to a lot of his biographers and people close to him and everything. And just the connection between Trump and Jimmy Carter, I think, is so unavoidable at this point because they all, were telling me that a lot of the renewed interest in Jimmy Carter comes from this feeling of we gave the keys to this like horrible person, this like just by every measure, on the macro and the micro, just someone who is a bully and self-obsessed and that's not even getting into his like criminal stuff and the way he treats women and immigrants and everything, and all of that kind of prompted a turn back to someone who's, I think, like smallness and humility, those qualities took on kind of a new sheen in the light
Hmm.
in light of
Hmm.
kind of Trump. So I don't know. In some ways, it's almost, again, it's almost poetic, right? That Jimmy Carter goes out as Trump is coming in again.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about Jimmy Carter and that period that you describe, I mean, I remember that really clearly. I think one of the things about Jimmy Carter that I think even his admirers would say is that there was an element, part of his kind of cult of uprightness that was always a fixture of who he was that he could come off to some people as being kind of sanctimonious,
Mhm.
right? I'm so pure. I'm so pure. Um, and but even to the extent that there are some negatives to that, it is definitely the inverse of Trumpism, right? Because
Totally.
Trumpism is like he's not even lying and saying he's pure. He's like, I'm dirty. And that's, that it's he is so the inverse, that you would never say Trump is like sanctimonious, like don't attack me, I'm so pure. It's he revels in his awfulness, in his bulliness and so forth. And I'll say this, that I basically through the 80s, as you say, Jimmy Carter was the liberal, the soft liberal do-gooder failure, right? And every time any Democrat would run for anything, you say, "Ah, remember Carter, remember Jimmy Carter." And the funny thing about that was, because he was you know the the icon of liberalism, and in fact, Jimmy Carter was not liberal, certainly not in the context of the 70s. Now, certain things, environment and the human rights dimension, and there's certainly a certain degree to which a lot of the human rights stuff kind of went out the door in the second half of his presidency. There's a whole kind of, a whole story there. But you do have this irony that a lot of, to the extent that neoliberalism is a thing, neoliberalism as government by sort of management and running things by the market, a lot of that starts under Jimmy Carter. A lot of the
Mhm.
deregulation starts under Jimmy Carter. So the whole idea that he's like the arch liberal was it had to do with him being the one who went out when the arch, you know when the demigod of conservatism came in. But Jimmy Carter was that during the 1980s, and I think it was either in 1992 or 1996, which again are Bill Clinton's two Democratic conventions. It was one of those two. It was basically the first time they let Carter come to one since 1980. He was banished. You did not want to see Jimmy Carter. He was this like, kind of horrible thing that Democrats didn't want to have anything to do with. And I remember, and I can't remember whether it was in 1992 or 96, where it was the first time Democrats say like, well, he wasn't a good president, but he's one of us, and we can kind of do a little, say he put solar panels on the White House roof and so. But it's really true that it took a long time, not to where you could have something like now, or kind of like, oh, the Habitat for Humanity and this, that, and the other, that people would even allow themselves to be seen in Jimmy Carter's presence, right? He kind of did carry that for at least a decade, and in some ways between it kind of, it's only like, I think by the Bush era, where he was again sort of rehabilitated in, like, in Soviet terms, right?
Mhm.
As someone you could at least mention in democratic polite company.
Yeah. So, I don't know. I've been reading some of the stories of people who have come to visit, on his way out, and I have to say, like, oh, they made me cry. They were really sweet. You just had It's a good thing to read if you're feeling really deflated by everything right now. Like, it's actually, I don't know if our listeners feel the same, but the election has like kind of hit me more now than it did at the time. I think having Kamala, have to hold court over the certification, it's such an encapsulation of like, you can have your issues with her campaign or whatever, but like, it's only Democrats who have to do that stuff, who have to stand there and take it on the chin and be grown-ups. And, when Trump loses, he throws a coup and a tantrum and would never whatever. But it's just
Didn't show up for the inauguration, which in some ways is
right.
almost, in my mind, it's obviously not worse than the coup, but it's more tacky than the coup. Like, I
Right.
get why you have a coup. You want to stay president. but like not showing up because you're just too much of a wuss to kind of just, as you say, take it on the chin and say, I lost. I
Right.
lost. Just
But
doesn't even have that in him.
all of that has just come together for me in a way that, like, I'm bummed. I'm really bummed right now. And the reading these pieces about these, like, just super normal people who, really like things about him, like, really like that he went back to his small hometown and taught Sunday school and,
And
really
lived in a little
tried to.
ranch house for like the second
Yeah.
half of his life, basically. No, I mean, look, any ex-president, you get on some boards, you play a lot of golf, and like, you know, it's kind of what Obama's done mostly.
Mhm.
Like whatever. Like he doesn't have. I mean, I'm sure a good whatever. It's not all he does, but kind of right. He's a kind of lives a nice life and everything, and like whatever. Nothing wrong with living a nice life, but Carter made decisions about just a different kind of person, right?
And just a nice detail about that, which maybe we can end on, is I was reading about how, he and Rosalind, they're kicked out of the White House, right? One term. I'm sure nothing felt more cataclysmic at the time. And part of how they like redirected the rest of their life together was that he was like trying to comfort her about, she was so upset and she was like, what are we going to do now? They're still like relatively young. There's all this life left to live.
Yeah, like late
And
50s, I think.
right. And so he
Yeah.
just kept telling her, about all the kind of good stuff they were going to do and how they were going to have meaningful, rich lives. And in the process of kind of like comforting her that way, he started to really believe it. And then, you know, I don't know. It's nice. It feels like something that is gone from America right now.
Yeah, well, certainly, we have a culture at the moment that gives great approbation, not just towards bad things, but selfish and chintzy and cheap things,
Mhm.
right? I mean, Richard Nixon obviously is a pretty bad president, right? I mean, to put it mildly. Um, but you do have a lot about our political culture right now that rewards and glorifies behavior on Donald Trump's part, which isn't even maybe the worst parts of it, but the parts of it that are just being a bully and being greedy in a very small and transactional way. And that does leave you kind of feeling, where are the nice things that you can kind of feel warm inside about, even when things are in the big picture not great. And that's a reality that we have to live with right now. And so it makes sense that Jimmy Carter, I think there's still a lot of room for disagreement about how he managed the job of being president, but he certainly in his life uh, stood true to a lot of the things that we like to believe are essential to who we are, right? And so it all kind of comes together, and there it is.
I guess the part of it just to think of is, I mean, it's what you said, right? It's like he was banished from the DNC. He was the laughing stock. Reagan was in and flashy and exciting, and he was dull and tired and over. And, you know, it didn't take that long before there was a reexamination of that and a re-excavation. And I mean, the right wing is ascendant right now, but things tend to cycle and swing and, you know.
History doesn't end. History doesn't end. That's a really important lesson, I think, for anybody who thinks about politics, and particularly at this moment, that it doesn't, and that's something that I think should keep all of us humble when you're sort of coming off like big victories. History doesn't end, and it doesn't end when you're kind of really, kind of nursing your wounds about a very terrible defeat. That it also doesn't end in that case. So,
All right.
all right. Well,
Good
that's
place to leave it.
good place to leave it. For all of you who are going to join us on the 15th down in DC, can't wait to see you again a week from today. And as I said at the outset, we've got, I think, about 20 or 30 tickets left. Probably will be sold out by the time by this time next week. So if you're interested in coming and seeing us, definitely buy a ticket. And I think that's all we have for this week.
All
Anything
right.
else?
Nope. See you next
Later.
week in person.
All right. See you then.
The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.